Apple hit $1 trillion in asset valuation, the first company in the history of the world to have its stock worth $1 trillion or more. So it made big news, and the business press went overboard. Oh, amazing. What a business model. How brilliant CEO Tim Cook is. What's next? Is it going to be another record? And so I took that apart. And basically, what we have is a business model by Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, that is fundamentally relying on serf labor in one factory complex in China. They have 1.3 million workers in serf-like conditions. That's the contractor to Apple that makes the iPhones. And then the other part of the business model is high-priced iPhones. I'll get to that in a minute. And the third leg of this three-legged stool is massive use of profits to buy back Apple stock. Now, if listeners don't think this affects a lot of people in this country, give me a few minutes. Number one, stock buybacks are not determined by the shareholders. There's no vote. There's no advice. It was determined by Tim Cook and maybe one or two other executives at the top, the hired hands. They have said earlier this year they're going to buy back $100 billion, that's with a B, of their stock. And the general press says, oh, that's good for shareholders. Guess what? Apple shareholders may have wanted more of that money distributed to them directly in cash dividends instead. That is a sign of mismanagement, that they have nothing else to do with this huge cache of profits from overpriced iPhones. They don't have anything better to do than to buy back their stock, which just incidentally increases the metric value of the executive compensation of Tim Cook and his colleagues at the top of this giant company. It doesn't do much for the stock. It may go up a little bit, may go down. There are far more serious things that are going to affect Apple stock as to whether there is going to be a new Samsung phone, whether tariffs are going to be applied by Trump on Chinese imports, which would include iPhones. But just look at this figure for a moment before we talk about its uses. $100 billion is more than 10 years of the budget of the Environmental Protection Agency, more than 10 years. The agency in the federal government to protect worker health and safety, OSHA, their budget is $500 million. That's 0.5% of the stock buyback. Just to show you public expenditures on very important matters of health and safety compared to private affluence and waste. Now, what could they have done with this $100 billion? For $2 billion, a mere $2 billion, they would have doubled the wages of those 1.3 million workers in China. For another 2% of the $100 billion, they could have vastly improved the recycling and the protection of the environment and the workers who are exposed to used iPhones and used computer dismantling. Deadly work. Just $2 billion. They could have increased their employee salaries. They could have shored up the employee pension fund. They could have engaged in more research and development. They could have found productive investment to employ workers in this country for a change. They could have done any number of things. But instead, they bought back their stock, which I have called wasting, burning profits. And that is characteristic now of all these big successful companies. In the last 10 years, U.S. corporations have bought back $7 trillion of their stock. So Marxists of many, many generations ago could never have predicted that these corporations would make so much profit turned into capital. They didn't know what to do with it other than to buy back the stock. I've written Tim Cook about this. I bought a few Apple shares, so I wrote him as a shareholder. Doesn't matter. Didn't answer. In fact, someone ought to do a project where non-shareholders send 10 letters to corporations and shareholders send the same 10 letters asking for a response, asking for a reaction, asking for a disclosure. There's no difference. These barons at the top of these corporations, these private governments, don't feel they have any responsibility even to those people who own a part of their company, the shareholders. And that's true for the big shareholders who don't use their muscle, like Fidelity, Vanguard, the teacher pension funds. They just buy in, rise with the stock. There's an article recently by a finance professor talking about Apple's financial model. For example, in order to shell out $100 billion, they borrowed money. So Apple under Steve Jobs never was in debt for a cent. Now Apple has $130 billion in debt. So it's low interest rates. They took advantage of it, deducted it. But here we go. It increases the stability in an economic downturn of companies that have these kinds of quirky financial models. Another thing Apple could have done, because it's a notorious tax evader, some would call tax avoider. You know, it's into Ireland and other tax havens. It's been enforced against by an awakening European Union. Tim Cook is outraged, but they pay very little income tax because they game the jurisdictions, nations, and play off the various tax laws and the tax havens against, say, the tax laws in the U.S. or, say, China. So one thing they could have done is pay their fair share of taxes. Now, you look at the business pages, and it's all Tim Cook, the great CEO. Tim Cook, the great planner, the strategist, the builder of the biggest company on earth. It's time to dismantle the propaganda and see what actually is happening. And you can start with how much you are paying for that iPhone. If that iPhone produces that level of profit, that Apple doesn't know what to do with it other than buy back their stock in order to increase the metrics for their compensation package, then maybe you iPhone owners should say, cut your prices, Apple. We're sick of paying through the nose. There's a great book that shows what happens when executive compensation determines corporate policy, all the way down to investment strategies, all the way down to what they pay employees, what kind of R&D they do, how they pay their taxes. It's called The CEO Pay Machine by Steve Clifford, The CEO Pay Machine. We had Steve on our show some months ago, but his message bears repeating because it's not getting out on the cable business shows or in the news features, with a few exceptions. Take Walmart. Walmart has bought back over $50 billion of their stock, and they have 1 million workers who are making less today than Walmart workers made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. Although Walmart is increasing their minimum wage, and it's moving just about close to what workers under Sam Walton made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. So they're burning their profits instead of giving their workers a decent living? I mean, this is crazy what's going on. And the Securities Exchange Commission is doing nothing because of the business judgment rule. They say, oh, it's the business judgment rule. The shareholders' money can be turned into anything by the bosses at the top, and the shareholders don't have to vote on it. They're just the owners, after all. That's why corporate capitalism is destroying capitalism. Because one of the principles of capitalism is if you own part of a company, you have some say in how it's run. You don't just get the message from your hired hands at the top in their executive suites, the message that says, you don't like what we're doing? You can sell your stock. No, shareholders will say, we don't like what you're doing and we're going to change what you're doing. You're not going to just say, you don't like what we're doing? Quit. That's a prescription to letting the rascals stay in place and further depreciate and degrade the wealth in this country, and who actually has earned so much of it, the workers, and not getting it. Did you know all this, Steve, David?
It seems to me that should be the sharp point of the message for political candidates, that if you like capitalism, it's actually being destroyed by the quote unquote capitalists. And you can demonize socialism all you want, but the biggest socialists are these crony capitalists.
Yeah, we call it corporate socialism. And you just touched on something very interesting, Steve, which is this is the message the Democrats should take up against the Trumpsters in the November election, because it affects everything: pensions, it affects employee wages, it affects constructive investment. Actually, U.S. companies, because they pay their bosses and manipulate it much more than foreign companies are able to do for their bosses, they actually have a lower rate of investment. It's been declining because they have all these little things they play around with, like stock buybacks. And so this really affects everyone. And it affects companies who say, oh, we have to pay less taxes, Congress. We want a tax cut from Congress and the White House because we need capital for productive investments. And the Democrats never say, really? How come you've burned $7 trillion in stock buybacks over the last 10 years? Why didn't you use that for productive investment and pay your fair share of taxes and not get a tax cut that Trump and the Republican Congress produced last year? So these are great arguments, and I don't know a single Democratic senator or any candidate running for office, with the possible exception of Congressman Tim Ryan from Youngstown, who's making these arguments. I don't even see Bernie Sanders making the stock buyback argument. And the other thing is this: if these corporations have money to burn, then they should be required to pay sales taxes. Now, you and I, others, go into a store, listeners, and you'll pay 6, 7, 8% sales tax on some necessities in life, depending on the state you're in. You might pay a local city tax, like in New York, and a statewide sales tax. How come today or tomorrow or wherever, someone can buy $100 million worth of Apple stock or ExxonMobil stock or Pfizer stock or Bank of America stock and not pay a dime in sales tax? That's why Bernie Sanders is recommending, along with Senator Elizabeth Warren and the Nurses of America, the organized California Nurses Association, and other nurses' labor unions who picketed on this, they're demanding what's called a transaction tax, a speculation tax on Wall Street transactions, which one will dim some of the crazy manipulation and speculation that's been going on. It can lead to another crash like 10 years ago. And second, just think of this: a tiny sales tax, never mind 6, 7%, tiny sales tax like 1/2 of 1%, 1/2 of 1% can produce $300 billion a year that can go to repair our public works and create good jobs here. It can't be exported abroad. It can go to providing health care for people who don't have health care. It can go to improving our schools. And the Democratic Party doesn't want any part of it, except for the renegades. Senator Warren, Senator Sherrod Brown is in on this. So there's just a handful of senators. So when you meet these candidates running for office in November, listeners, throw some of these issues at them. Watch their reaction. Are they running for corporate power, or are they running for citizen power? Question you should ask them and say, who are you representing? Why aren't you shifting more power from the few to the many? I mean, the dialogue is so thin, it's so anemic. And then when the Democrats send you fundraising letters, they say, we're for an adequate wage, a living wage, but they never specify. I've gotten, for example, a letter from Senator Schumer from New York. He's talking about expanding health care, but he doesn't say single payer or full Medicare for all. He talks about improving minimum wage, but he doesn't say well, he's going to go for $12 or $15 an hour. That's why people don't think the Democrats are authentic, that they don't really mean what they say. And that's why they're losing elections and being landslided by the worst, most corrupt, most warmongering, most Wall Street indentured Republican Party in history. That's why, because people listen to the rhetoric of the Democrats and they say, well, it's pretty good rhetoric, but I don't believe you. Your record hasn't demonstrated it, and you're not specific enough for people who work on Elm Street and Main Street.
And the economic issues are harder to grasp than the social issues, whether it's immigration, gay marriage, abortion, all of those things. And so the Democrats feel like they're on safe ground there, but on the economic issues, they don't as you say, seem to have an approach for attacking what's going on now.
Even though that's how they used to win all their elections under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so many of their elections, Harry Truman, with bread and butter issues where people live, work, raise their families. They'll respond at the polls, but they got to believe these politicians.
They make the conversation about economics as complicated as the financial instruments that crash our economy.
Yeah, look at the words they use. Well, we're opposed to austerity. What is austerity? They should say we're opposed to driving down wages in an era of record corporate profits. We're opposed to shortening work weeks where people can only find work at Walmart for 23 hours a week at low wages. We're opposed to trying to shrink Social Security or limit Medicare. Never mind using the word austerity. One should just talk plain language. But the Democrats talk this because they're too busy dialing for corporate dollars for their campaign. They want it both ways. If they'd stop dialing for these dollars and start dialing for what people need in America, they wouldn't have to raise that kind of money. People would vote for them. They wouldn't have to put all these silly television ads on what they promised to do. They wouldn't have to just run against Trump. They could run for justice, for fair play, for a better life for people, for respect for their children and grandchildren, for a clean environment, for waging peace, for getting out of these military quagmires that are only increasing the backfire and the backlash from people whose backyards we're into, whose dictators we're supporting. They're compromised because they come in with their meetings, these Democrats. Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur told me once. She says, Ralph, we walk into the House Democratic Caucus meeting and the talk's about money. We sit down at the meeting and the talk's about money. We leave the meeting with our quota for raising more campaign money. And I said to her, and that's why the Democrats are losing.